John Jay, born in 1745, graduated from Columbia University in 1764 and continued on to study law. By 1774, he had become one of the most eminent members of the New York political scene and took part in many important events of the time. John Jay achieved many things in his lifetime, including authoring Federalist Papers, serving 2 terms as governor of New York, being appointed Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and being the first Chief Justice of the United States. Jay also had a strong influence on the abolitionist cause in New York and forefronted ideologies on the manumission of slaves. In the early 18th century, few people questioned the morality of slavery. Slavery had a large part in the development of the colonies and American states. The slave trade benefited many people. Merchants, sailors, and farmers based their lives on slave trade and slave labor. The only slight change came first in the Revolutionary War when free black Americans were allowed to join the ranks, but this was still out of desperation for soldiers. Hope for change also came with the drafting of the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 9, it states that the slave trade would be illegal after 1808. Still, the topic was precarious and controversial, and shown through a lack of the word slave anywhere in the document. Jay was one of the first and prominent advocates for the manumission and emancipation of slaves. Jay's father, Peter Jay, owned a large plantation with a considerable amount of slaves, and therefore John had an insight on the institution. In 1785, along with the political elite of New York, Jay started the New York Society for promoting the manumission of slaves. Their main objective was to protest the kidnapping of enslaved African Americans, to sell slaves elsewhere, and offer legal assistance to the victims. They also created African Free School, an institution established to educate African American children as equals to white children in their transition into distinguished society. One of their biggest accomplishments came later in 1799 when they had an instrumental part in campaigning and passing a law for the gradual abolition of slavery in the New York Assembly. More early on in his career, the drafting of the Constitution was also seen as a success in the abolitionist community. Jay, as president of the New York Manumission Society, addressed his peers after the Constitutional Convention in 1788, recorded in John Jay promoting the manumission of slavery. It begins with Jay's satisfaction over the recent additions to the Constitution concerning slavery. First off, he believes that Americans have been inconsistent on their views of human rights. The entire revolution was established on the set of ideals that every person deserved basic natural rights, representation in government, and religious tolerance among them. Although the entire concept of slavery contradicts every natural right Americans fought for back in 1775, Africa and India have long experienced unjustified oppression from countries such as America who claim to hold civil and religious liberty as the most of preeminent virtues. Jay says that those who are free and live an unoppressed life and who hold these ideals important ought not to persecute other individuals and subject them to slavery. He adds that this is more generally admitted in theory than practice, because Jay himself and his other peers owned slaves at the time of this address. Slaves brought affluence and wealth, and the elite were unwilling to give this up. Despite all these contradictions, Jay is also aware of the challenging task of making such a large group of men decide on anything. He also knows that slavery has long been a crucial part of the American development and will be extremely hard to demolish. However, he expresses slavery in general as a trivial mistake or error that developed into something difficult to eradicate. Although inhumane, America as a product should recognize enslavement as an unavoidable contributor. In the next paragraph, Jay addresses the conscientious people who did actually question the system of slavery. He could be referring to William Penn, who established Pennsylvania in 1787 as a Quaker colony and created the Society of Friends. They believed God united all humans. If a person wanted to live without sin, God would accept them. Therefore, all people who wanted to live this way were equals, disregarding any ethnicity. Later in the 1740s, 2 more prominent Quakers, John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, traveled throughout the colonies, convincing people to break off any connections they had to slavery. Jay recognizes their work and their struggle to make converts, but suggests the ratio of converts to the overall population of people still willing to accept slavery was far too small. Jay then transitions into speaking about the subject of his address, the results of the Constitutional Convention. He first seems to pardon the convention and their very lukewarm actions. He believes it is a tough task, and many opinions had to be incorporated. Many factions existed in America within the Union, between the East Coast, the Western frontier, the societal divides, and between the North and the South. Many views had to be integrated to create one document. The biggest divide that had the most influence on slavery was the geographical economic split between the North and South. Both territories had slaves, but Southerners owned plantations with larger magnitudes of slaves, and were therefore very defending of the practice. As Jay mentioned, several of the states conceived that restraints on slavery might be too rapid to consist with their particular circumstances. Southerners had to be compromised with to create a document that could ratify with all 13 colonies. Of 55 delegates that attended the convention, 25 were slave owners, showing the diverse livelihoods and opinions that were going to be brought to the table. Many debates broke out between delegates, including one after a South Carolinian proposal of the prohibition of government from regulating the Atlantic slave trade. A Northern delegate, Luther Martin of Maryland, argued that slavery is inconsistent with the ideals of the Revolution and is dishonorable to the American character to have such a feature in the Constitution, whereas a Southern delegate argued that if this clause was not added, Southern states shall not be parties to the Union, threatening secession. Here, the delicateness of the situation is demonstrated because to endure the next 50 years, the Union needed every single state or it could fall apart because the country at this juncture was decidedly weak. The end result is that the Atlantic slave trade would be banned after 20 years, and they agreed to remove a clause restricting the government's control over trade laws. This shows how careful the delegates had to be that ultimately led them to make tepid decisions, because the importance of the Union rendered it necessary that their wishes on that head should in some degree be gratified, something Jay had to mention to a society of generally radical Northerners. He then further explains how the outcome was positive, and considering the diverse opinions of the people in power, the complete and quick stop of the maltreatment of these people is highly unlikely. The Constitution does give a positive outlook on slavery because it outlaws the Atlantic slave trade in 20 years, instilling hope in abolitionists. Then Jay goes on to say that he will support anyone from the society who wishes to find supporters overseas, and endorses the correspondence between the society and France. He brings up the communication with Mons de Varville, the Secretary of Society. He is referring to Jacques-Pierre Brissot de Warville, the Girondins leader in the French Revolution later in 1799. However, he also created the Society of Friends of the Blacks in February 1788 to protect the black population of the West Indies. In June, he sailed to Pennsylvania and attended this meeting of the society as president of his association. De Warville was also a writer devoted to humanity and wrote many pamphlets about human rights, some of which are mentioned quickly in Jay's address. In the final paragraph, Jay lists all the positive outcomes. The African Free School has been established to educate black children. Manumission laws are being developed, and the exportation and importation of slaves will be illegal in 20 years. They also have hopes to make sure legally every person is free until they are proved enslaved, and cannot be kidnapped back into slavery. The overall tone of this paragraph is positive and progressive. Manumissions daily become more common among us, and the treatment which slaves in general meet with in this state is very little different from that of other servants. I have the honor to be, gentlemen, your humble servant, John Jay. He is hopeful and confident for the future. This document overall was to celebrate the advances they have made and look to the future for even more successes for the abolitionist cause.